Hiding in a bush in the French countryside, Special Operations Executive Agent Philip Schneidau is waiting patiently for one of two things to happen. Either he'll hear the reassuring drone of a Westland Lysander bringing safe passage back to England, or he'll hear the ominous footsteps of a German patrol. Given that he's just spent the last week collecting intelligence for the British government, Schneidau would much prefer the first option. 10 days earlier, Schneidau had parachuted into France carrying nothing but the British Intelligence Service's most high-tech communications device. Wrapped up in socks, Schneidau had concealed 10 homing pigeons. A shortage of lightweight radio equipment meant this was the best the Special Operations Executive could provide. 10 days later, and Schneidau had released all 10 of his top-secret pigeons, leaving him with no way of contacting his handlers back in Britain. But that didn't bother him because before leaving the country he'd arranged his pickup in minute detail with his pilot, Flight Lieutenant Wallace Farley. But Schneidau should have been worried because a few hundred miles away Wally Farley was having an argument. At RAF North Weald in Essex, word had just reached 419's Special Duties Flight that all operations were to be cancelled due to strong winds and heavy rain over the English Channel. Wally Farley was only too aware that without him, a valuable S.O.E agent who knows all about British intelligence procedures would be stranded behind enemy lines. If he was captured by the Germans, the consequences for S.O.E, other agents and contacts could be severe. Farley also knows that Schneidau is carrying vital intelligence that could be crucial to helping the Allies win the war. These were both convincing arguments which eventually persuaded his commanding officer, Wing Commander Geddes, to allow him to fly. Over the English Channel, the weather was every bit as bad as the forecast. Thrown around by the wind and blinded by rain, Farley must have wondered how he was ever going to find the field where Schneidau was hiding. Thankfully, as he crossed the French coast, the weather improved significantly, and shortly afterwards Farley was circling over the landing site. Relieved to see that his lift home had arrived, Schneidau wasted no time in flashing the pre-arranged identification letter with his torch. Seeing Farley reply to the signal with his landing lights, Schneidau illuminated 3 signal flares to mark the landing zone. So far, everything was going to plan, but as he came into land, Farley must have had dozens of thoughts running through his mind. What if this was a Gestapo trap? What if the ground was too soft and the aircraft got bogged down and stuck? What if there were night fighters waiting to pounce as soon as they took off again? Thankfully, none of these events transpired, and Farley carried out a textbook landing, turned the aircraft around and backtracked down the field to the first of the 3 lamps where he'd arranged to meet his passenger. As soon as the aircraft came to a stop, Schneidau scrambled up the modified ladder and into the back of the Westland Lysander. Farley opened the throttle and the aircraft gained speed, bouncing over the rough grass for just over 100 metres before climbing into the air. The whole process had taken no more than just a few minutes, but unfortunately the noise had attracted the attention of a passing German patrol. Thankfully, most of the rounds passed wide, but a lucky shot ripped through the bottom of the aircraft. Passing far too close for comfort, the bullet whistled between Farley's legs and smashed into the aircraft's compass. With the primary means of navigation destroyed, Farley had no choice but to point the aircraft roughly in the direction he thought was home, and hope for the best. By using whatever visual references they could find through the night sky, Farley and Schneidau reached the English Channel, where the weather was just as volatile as before. As if it was the plot of a Hollywood movie, the torrential rain works its way through the aircraft's electrical system and eventually shorts out the radio. With no idea where they are, and now unable to ask ground controllers for help, the 2 men fly on in the desperate hope they're going in the right direction. Almost 6 hours after they took off, Farley finally finds a gap in the clouds. Below them, waves are crashing against rocky cliffs, but the Lysander's crew had no way of knowing if they were over friendly or enemy territory. With the fuel tank beginning to run dry, there was only one way to find out. Farley pulled back the throttle and began to descend. The pilot lined up with a flat-looking field, but at the last second he saw anti-glider poles sticking up into the dawn skyline. With no fuel to do anything else, Farley closes his eyes and hopes he survives the crash. The Lysander dropped onto the grassy field and began smashing through the anti-glider poles, causing it to come to a violent and abrupt halt. It took a few moments for Farley and Schneidau to regain their senses, but when they did, they were relieved to find the soldiers racing to their assistance were wearing the khaki-green uniforms of the British Army. But the situation soon descended into total confusion when the soldiers appeared not to speak any English. After much shouting and arguing, it transpired the soldiers were in fact Scottish. Farley and Schneidau had managed to overshoot their base at North Weald by an astonishing 500 miles and had crashed on the west coast of Scotland. At the crash site, more arguments were taking place. The soldiers wanted to know more about the Lysander and its crew, but Farley couldn't very well admit that he was a special operations pilot and his passenger was an S.O.E agent. In the end, Farley gave just his last name and explained they were on a maritime patrol exercise. A weak and ultimately unbelievable explanation that saw the two men taken under guard to nearby RAF Oban. 500 miles south at RAF North Weald, hopes of seeing the Lysander and its crew again were rapidly fading away. When Wing Commander Geddes heard the news that a Lysander had crashed in Scotland, he dismissed the possibility of it being his men given the huge 500-mile overshoot. Fortunately, word filtered through that the pilot's name was Farley, and after a few phone calls the men were released and returned to their squadron. Schneidau returned to France at least once more before spending the rest of the war coordinating the air and sea transport of French and Polish agents. He retired from military service with the rank of squadron leader before returning to his pre-war life as an accountant. Philip Schneidau passed away in 1984. There's a significant mystery surrounding Wally Farley. By 1942, Farley had become one of the RAF's most experienced special operations pilots. Promoted to wing commander, Farley had taken command of No. 138 Special Duty Squadron based at RAF Tempsford. Wally Farley was killed in mysterious circumstances whilst on a highly classified mission to drop 2 Soviet agents by parachute over the Austrian Alps. The agents were part of Operation Whiskey, a mission so secret that even today we don't actually know much about it. What we do know is that at 9 p.m. on April 20th, 1942, Handley Page Halifax V9976 took off from an airfield somewhere in England. It headed towards Rotterdam before turning southeast, crossing Belgium, Luxembourg and France before entering Germany. Shortly after 1 a.m, the Halifax crashed into the Alps south of Munich near the town of Tegernsee. The wreckage of the Halifax was discovered the next day by an Austrian man called Karl Vogel. Vogel claimed to find a briefcase handcuffed to a body which he then turned over to the authorities. He reported that the information inside was so important he was personally decorated by Hermann Goering and given a reward of 500 Reichsmarks. If this was true, what could possibly have been inside the briefcase? Karl Vogel was, however, well known in the local community as a drunk, and his story has to be treated with some caution. It was reported that Vogel took a different and more secluded route down the mountain, causing rumours to circulate that he'd found survivors in the crash and had been bribed to help them escape. Since most agents were dropped with money to give to resistance groups, it's possible, if not probable, that there was in fact no briefcase or dramatic escape down a mountain, and Vogel simply looted his newfound wealth from the crash site. He does appear to have made a habit after the war of paying for goods with foreign coins and daring people to ask him where he got them. The actual objective of the 2 Soviet agents also remains a mystery. We know that their mission was codenamed Operation Whiskey, and memos exist suggesting that Whiskey was part of a larger operation made up of other beverage-based missions. It seems that much of the information about Whiskey is still classified, and speculation around the mission is far-reaching. It's likely the mission was simply to liaise with resistance groups, but given that the crash site was just 15 minutes flying time from Hitler's Bavarian home, the Berghof, theories exist suggesting it was part of a plot to take out the Führer, much like the S.O.E and Czech intelligence had carried out against the SS officer Reinhard Heydrich. Operation Whiskey was clearly important because the mission had already been aborted on 3 separate occasions due to bad weather, and a memo exists showing that the Soviets were pressuring the RAF to drop the agents at the earliest opportunity. Perhaps that's why Farley felt the need to fly on the mission. His presence on the flight was unusual because he wasn't actually qualified to fly the Halifax and was operating simply as an observer. On the surface, the flight appears to have been a straightforward parachute dropping exercise, hardly something that an experienced and high-ranking officer like Farley needed to be involved in. Perhaps he had concerns that there'd be tensions between the Halifax's mostly Polish crew and the Soviet agents. After all, the Soviets had invaded Poland at the start of the war, and in less than 2 years had arrested 500,000 Poles and executed more than 60,000 people. Whatever the reason, Farley's decision to fly had cost him his life, and Operation Whiskey would become just another of World War II's great mysteries.